Cimoooooooo! What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a card discussion on Blizzard, a brand new card being released in Rise of the Duelist, the set following Eternity Code. Now, we've been talking about some of these newer cards because they have some very interesting effects, and Blizzard also falls into that category. So I'm going to go ahead and read off the effect for you guys. It is a quick play spell that has an effect that reads as follows. You can target one face-up spell your opponent controls. For the rest of the turn, negate its effects that activate on the field. Also, negate effects that activate on the field from any spell with the same original name. Also, if the targeted card would be sent to the opponent's graveyard this turn, return it to the opponent's hand instead. And you can only activate one card with this card's name per turn. So this is interesting. Now, a lot of people have been comparing this card to a couple of different cards. The first comparison has been to a card like Red Reboot, which I don't think it's like a direct comparison, but I kind of see what people are saying. This is like a spell version of Red Reboot, kind of, right? So Red Reboot, when you activate it, first of all, you can activate it a lot easier because you can just pay half your life points and basically play it at any time, and it's a trap card, so it has a lot of like different synergies there. But when it comes to Red Reboot, not only are you negating the trap card that your opponent used, but you're preventing your opponent from activating any other trap cards for the rest of the turn, whereas Blizzard is only stopping that specific spell card that's being activated. Now, another card that people have been comparing this to is Called by the Grave, and I think this might be a more accurate comparison because where Called by the Grave is like stopping monsters from the graveyard and negating their effects, this card is stopping spell cards that are on the field, but also like stopping their effects at the same time. And they're both quick play and they're both spells, so I think that's a much better comparison, even though the cards have completely separate applications. So let's talk about Blizzard for a little bit. When it comes to Blizzard, I want to talk about first in the context of hard once per turn cards versus non-hard once per turn. So let's take, for instance, a card like Pot of Desires, right? So if your opponent activates Pot of Desires, they're going to pay cost by banishing 10, and then you chain Blizzard. So what's going to happen? Well, Blizzard is going to negate Pot of Desires, but since Pot of Desires would go to the graveyard, instead, it's going to go back to their hand. Now, because it is a hard once per turn, they're not going to be able to activate another copy, and even if it weren't, they would just have it negated anyway, and we're going to get to that right now. So case in point, what's a non-once per turn spell that we can use? I'd say a pretty popular one is Invocation. So this is where things get a little bit interesting. So if your opponent goes Invocation and you chain Blizzard, not only would the Invocation be negated, it's going to get bounced back to their hand, which is definitely a downside, but because it's a non-once per turn, they could theoretically activate it again. However, it would just negate that because Blizzard negates all activated effects of the spell with the same name for the duration of the turn. And I think that's really big, especially for the non-hard once per turn spell cards like Invocation or anything along those lines, because being able to stop not just the first activation, but like the follow-up activation if the opponent has multiples or the means to get multiples, I think is a really huge plus in the eyes of this card. Now, I want to talk about this card in the context of all the different spell types. So there's 6 different spell types in the game. Normal, Quick Play, and Ritual are spells that if Blizzard were to negate those in response to those cards being activated, then those cards would then get bounced back to the hand instead of going to the graveyard. However, the other 3 types of spells being Continuous, Field, and Equip, those cards, even though they're negated, wouldn't go back to the opponent's hand immediately unless the opponent forced them to go back by either like linking off the monster in terms of like the equip, or, you know, overlaying another field spell on top of one that was already negated. Different means like that. There are ways to circumvent Blizzard, but it's interesting when you look at it through the lens of the last 3 being Field, Continuous, and Equip, because being able to negate the effect of the card and it's not going to go back to their hand, that's really big. So for instance, right, let's take like Magical Meltdown. If you negate your opponent's Magical Meltdown, unless they have another field spell to overlay on top of that Magical Meltdown, then the one that they just used won't be going back to their hand, because then by the time they overlay, the effect of Blizzard will have worn off, and that card will go to the graveyard. So effectively, you're going to stop the search, and then it becomes as good as something like Ash Blossom or anything that would have negated the effect of that Magical Meltdown to begin with. The same thing goes for any of the non-hard card once per turn field spells as well, because even if they had another copy, they would be wasting a copy because let's say like Trickstar Light Stage, I know the card is limited, but just hear me out. If you go Light Stage and Blizzard negates Light Stage, even if you play another Light Stage on top of it, it would go back to the hand, but the one you just played would get negated, so you wouldn't be making any progress. It wouldn't make any sense to do that, so you're effectively icing down the card entirely and preventing your opponent from using any of that card for the duration of the turn. This is complemented by the last part of the effect, that instead of the spell cards going to the graveyard, they're gonna go back to the opponent's hand. Now, instinctively, this may be a downside, but there are some instances where this is actually rather good. So let's, for example, take like True Draco. True Draco spell cards they want to have in the graveyard after they've maybe resolved the effect, because they want to get the benefit of popping an opposing spell or trap in the instance of something like True Draco Heritage. However, if you use Blizzard in response to the activation of one of those cards, if they had a way to get the Heritage to the graveyard, it would go back to the hand, because Blizzard only stops the on-field activations, but because it never hits the graveyard and goes back to their hand, not only are they not allowed to play any more uses of the card for the rest of the turn, but it's never going to get the graveyard trigger, so it's not going to pop any of your cards. And obviously that's very specific because there aren't many spell cards that have triggers in the graveyard like the True Draco spells, but I still think it's cool that there's a card that allows you to kind of play around any card that would trigger in the graveyard in that sense, like the True Draco spells. Another application is Pendulum monsters, because when Pendulum monsters are in the Pendulum zone, they count as spell cards, and so any of those effects that would activate are considered spell effects. So there are some Pendulum cards that either pop themselves or pop one another, so that way they can either use their effects or they can clear out the scales, so that way they can make room for other cards or to fix their Pendulum scale properly. You can use Blizzard pretty effectively here because it effectively just acts as another way to stop those Pendulum cards, and then that way they're not even allowed to activate cards with the same effect, because there are some Pendulum cards that you can use multiple times in the scale, and by pretty much freezing their ability to do that, that's going to put them in a pretty precarious position. Now, as with all cards I discuss, I definitely want to discuss the downside. So first and foremost, it only stops activated effects, and you may think that that kind of covers a lot, but there are some specific cards that don't really lose to this card. I'm looking at you, Mystic Mind, and that can be a real bummer. And again, every card isn't going to be good against every other card. However, there are some instances that when you're looking at playing a card like Blizzard, and you know that a card like, Mystic Mind exists, or Super Polymerization, which can't be responded to, it makes the playability of a card like that go down pretty significantly. The second downside to this card is that your opponent is more than likely going to get the card back that gets negated by Blizzard. I would say 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to be using Blizzard to negate a normal or a quick play spell. Not that you're not going to use it for field spells and continuous spells as well, but chances are a lot of normal and quick play spells are usually seen in the competitive format because of their high power level, and if you're going to be negating something like that, they're just going to have it again for next turn. And you may think, well, that's pretty bad. However, you have to think about the fact that most of the time that's going to at least buy you one turn so that you can turn the game around in your favor, maybe set up a card that can negate that card permanently, and then you don't have to worry about it, or just completely blank the card in general so that it becomes a non-issue. In either case, it's still a downside you have to consider. I would say that's why some people compare this to Red Reboot, because Red Reboot gives them another card to work with, whereas Blizzard is going to effectively give them that card back for the following turn. So it's not like an end-all be-all, but it really puts you on a clock and puts you in the driver's seat to make the correct decisions to ensure that that Blizzard is going to pay off, because you're losing that card advantage to ensure that you're either going to win the next turn or set up in such a way that whatever card you negated with Blizzard is not going to matter in the slightest. And I think the third and final downside of Blizzard is it seems a bit niche, right? Like, I'm thinking about this in my deck building, and am I really gonna justify playing Blizzard to negate something like a Pot of Desires, or Invocation, or cards that other cards could potentially negate, but have some more flexibility in terms of what else they could possibly negate. So like in the instance of like Pot of Desires, yeah, Blizzard can stop it, but so can a card like Ash Blossom. So you kind of have to think to yourself, is the meta tailored in such a way that a card like Blizzard is going to really come in handy? So I think it's going to be very format dependent. Now, if we had this card, let's say like 6, 7, 8 months ago, and maybe for the better part of the year before that, I think this card would have seen tons of play. Could you imagine Blizzard in Sky Striker mirrors? Imagine a card that could not only negate Mobilize Engage, but then negate all other copies of it being activated for the remainder of that turn. That would be insane. The fact that then you could have full tempo over the game, ensure that your opponent is not going to get set up properly. I mean, that in and of itself could just end the Sky Striker player's turn. I would not have been surprised if Blizzard back during Sky Striker format was side decked in mass specifically for that mirror match, or maybe even main decked if the Sky Striker meta was heavy enough to be warranted to side deck, or excuse me, to main deck this specific card. I think it's definitely possible, but it's very situational and contingent on the meta being in a specific place, because I can't exactly see people just wanting to play Blizzard to only stop spell cards without having any other added flexibility. I think the card is very powerful. I think people are going to try it out, and it might see a small amount of play, but we'll just have to see. I think the design of it is very cool though. And to have a Called by the Grave for spells, I think is a nice welcome inclusion for the game. So guys, that's gonna wrap up my video for today. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Blizzard. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.